A black woman, a judge brutalized by two white police officers. What happens next will be shocking. The Mississippi Night was a vast, primordial creature, a living, breathing entity of staggering power and presence. It hummed with the electric, feverish chorus of a billion insects. Their frantic calls a wall of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. The air, thick enough to taste, was a potent cocktail, sweating a cloying perfume of honeysuckle so sweet it bordered on decay, the ghostly scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the deep, dark, fecund rot of the swamp. This palpable darkness pressed in from all sides, a heavy, velvet cloak so tangible it felt as though it could smother a person, wrap them in its humid embrace, and pull them down into the rich, black soil. It was a world and a lifetime away from the sterile, refrigerated, and unnervingly silent corridors of the Hinds County Courthouse, a place of sharp angles and artificial light that Imani Wallace had departed hours before. The twin beams of her obsidian sedan, a Lexus LS she'd bought herself as a gift for her 10th year on the bench, sliced through the oppressive gloom. They carved a fleeting, brilliant tunnel through a haunted cathedral of ancient oaks, their gnarled limbs heavy with thick, trailing shawls of Spanish moss. The moss, gray and skeletal, wept in the humid air, swaying like a congregation of spectral mourners in her wake. The silhouettes of the trees were a stark, arthritic dance against a bruised twilight sky that bled purple and indigo at the western horizon. This was not merely a drive. It was a pilgrimage, a necessary shedding of skin. She drove with all four windows down, an act that offered no illusion of a cooling breeze in the suffocating, motionless air. Instead, it was an invitation for the symphony of the wild to rush in and overwhelm the sterile echoes of the courtroom. The frantic, almost painfully loud hum of the cicadas, a high-strung thrum that spoke of short lives lived at a fever pitch. The deep, baritone grumbling of bullfrogs from unseen bayous, a sound so resonant it felt like the earth itself clearing its throat. And beneath it all, the mournful, heartbreaking coo of a distant dove, a sound of such profound and simple sorrow it felt like a direct channel to the grief of the world. This auditory immersion was a balm to her frayed spirit, a ritual of purification she had practiced for 2 decades. It was her time to slowly, deliberately unlace the immense, crushing weight of the black robe, to silence the echo of the resonant gavel, and to scrub from the deepest corners of her soul the impossible, soul-crushing calculus of modern justice. Today, the scales had felt particularly, cruelly unbalanced. Today, the weight was almost unbearable. The face of a young woman, a girl really, named Keisha, was seared onto the back of her eyelids, a ghost that flickered with every blink. She could have been Imani's own niece, a freshman at Howard with a future bright with promise. But Keisha's future was now a narrow, concrete corridor. Imani saw again the girl's terrified eyes, wide with a raw disbelief that had not yet had time to harden into the cynical despair of the truly lost. Keisha was caught in the inexorable, grinding gears of a system that so often confused procedure with justice and offered scant room for mercy, let alone grace. Keisha's public defender, a good man named Ben Carter, whose shoulders were permanently slumped by the weight of 400 other active cases, had been hopelessly outmatched. He was a weary-foot soldier armed with a pocket knife against a mechanized division. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was a slick, ambitious young man with a politician's easy smile and a shark's dead, black eyes. He had taken the simple, desperate facts of the case. A 20-year-old single mother, recently fired, who had stolen diapers, formula, and Tylenol, and had masterfully painted her as a calculated menace to society, a harbinger of urban decay, threatening their peaceful community. Imani's hands had been bound. Mississippi's 3 strikes law, the mandatory minimums, the cold, unforgiving chains of precedent and statute, they had formed a cage around her discretion, leaving her no choice but to impose a sentence that felt less like justice and more like a brutal act of vengeance. 3 years. 3 years for diapers and baby formula. The hollowness in her chest, the cold, dead space where her unwavering belief in the system used to reside, felt like a profound, personal failure, a cancer eating away at her soul. The law is a shield, baby girl. Her father's voice, a low, rumbling baritone that she could still conjure on nights like this, echoed in the cathedral of her memory. She was 12 years old, her small hand swallowed in his large, warm one, standing on the sun-baked steps of the courthouse in downtown Jackson. He'd just lost a case, defending a black sharecropper who'd been cheated out of an entire year's wages by a plantation owner with friends in high places. Her father, a man who had stared into the monstrous face of Jim Crow and still, somehow, managed to believe in the promise of the law, knelt down, his eyes etched with a weariness that went bone deep, but his grip on her hand was firm, an anchor in her young world. It's meant to protect the weak from the strong. That's its only noble purpose. But you have to remember, Imani, sometimes the strong get their hands on it. Sometimes they learn how to twist it, how to turn that shield into a cage. His words had never felt more true or more painful than they did tonight. They were a prophecy that had become her daily reality. Deep in the labyrinth of these heavy memories, she almost missed it. A brief, aberrant flicker in her rearview mirror. It wasn't the warm, amber glow of another car's headlights. It was a flash of unnatural, sterile light against the organic dark, like a camera flash deep in the woods. Gone as quickly as it appeared. Heat lightning, perhaps a common phantom in the Mississippi summer. A stray reflection off a distant tin roof or a piece of forgotten farm equipment. She dismissed it, her mind immediately returning to Keisha's face, to the sound of her own gavel falling like a guillotine. Then it came again, closer this time, more insistent. A strobing, violent, gut-wrenching pulse of red and blue. The colors of authority and emergency, colors that, in this context, on this road, felt like pure aggression. They seemed to suck all the peace out of the night, to poison the very air, leaving a vacuum filled with a pure ice-cold dread that was both ancient and immediate. Her heart didn't race, it seized. It was a cold, hard knot tightening in her chest, a painful, involuntary clench of muscle that stole her breath and sent a jolt of Arctic water through her veins. This wasn't the intellectual fear of a confrontation. It was a primal, cellular response, a muscle memory ingrained in the collective DNA of every Black American who has ever dared to exist in a space deemed not their own, who has ever driven a nice car, alone on a dark country road. Composure was her armor. It had been her shield her entire life, a carefully constructed fortress of diction, posture, and unwavering eye contact, built to withstand a world that often saw her skin as a provocation before it ever saw her mind. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the thick, humid air a dead weight in her lungs. She flicked her turn signal, the sharp click-clack, sounding like a bone breaking in the sudden, profound silence. She eased the heavy sedan onto the gravel shoulder. The crunch of the tires was the only sound now, loud, coarse, and terrifyingly final, like the sound of a grave being filled. The patrol car, a hulking Ford Interceptor that looked more like an instrument of war than a vehicle of peace, loomed behind her, its massive grille filling her rearview mirror like a predator's snarl. Its high beams, a pair of angry, probing eyes, pinned her car in a brutal, accusatory glare that bleached the color from the night and threw the weeping Spanish moss into sharp, spidery relief. It felt like an interrogation lamp. Two figures detached themselves from its shadows, their forms silhouetted against the blinding, strobing lights. The first was a large, barrel-chested man, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked with a swaggering gait, a roll of the shoulders that broadcasted a lifetime of unchallenged authority and the casual menace that came with it. The second, younger and leaner, moved with a twitchy, nervous energy, his movements sharp and bird-like. He took up a tactical position by the rear passenger side of her car, his hand already resting, almost casually, on the butt of his holstered weapon. The tableau was set, a stage for a play she knew all too well. The older officer approached her window, his bulk blocking the flashing lights and casting her in a sudden, deep shadow. His name tag, glinting in the intermittent glare, read Caldwell. He leaned down, his face a florid, sweat-sheen mask, and brought with him the acrid smell of stale coffee, wintergreen tobacco, and something else, a faint, sour odor of ingrained contempt that seemed to emanate from his very pores. "Evening, ma'am," he began, his drawl as thick and slow as molasses dripping in the dead of winter. "License and registration, please." His tone was deceptively placid, a practiced monotone he had likely used 1,000 times, a flat surface that could curdle into menace in a single heartbeat. Imani moved with the practiced, almost theatrical slowness of someone who knew the script by heart, a script she had seen play out from the other side of the bench with tragic frequency. She understood that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted as aggression, any hesitation as defiance, any question as a challenge. It was a deadly dance on a razor's edge. She retrieved the documents from her glove compartment, her hands a testament to a will of iron, showing no tremor. She passed them through the open window. "Is there a reason for the stop, Officer Caldwell?" she asked, her voice calm and measured, the same even, authoritative tone she used to command respect in her courtroom. It was a voice that expected answers. He took the documents, but didn't look at them. His eyes, small and hard like ball bearings set deep in his fleshy face, roamed the interior of her car. They lingered on the expensive cream leather of her seats, the polished burl wood of the dashboard, and a locked, monogrammed leather briefcase on the passenger seat. His gaze was an audit, a judgment, a silent calculation of her worth and her place. "We'll get to that," he said, his eyes finally returning to her, holding her gaze. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am." A cold alarm bell, sharp and clear as a crystal glass struck with a fork, rang in the depths of Imani's mind. This is a deviation. The well-rehearsed script had just been thrown out. Terry versus Ohio flashed through her legal mind. A traffic stop requires reasonable suspicion of a traffic violation. In order to exit, the vehicle escalates the encounter, requiring a higher level of suspicion regarding a threat to officer safety. This was a dangerous and legally dubious deviation. "Officer, with all due respect," she said, keeping her voice level, a monumental effort of will that took every ounce of her training and discipline. "I have not consented to a search of my person or my vehicle, and you haven't provided probable cause for this stop, let alone a reason to fear for your safety. May I ask again why you are ordering me to exit my car?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed into slits. The placid mask of professional duty fell away completely, revealing the sneering, contemptuous face that lay beneath. Her composure, her articulate questioning, her calm refusal to be immediately cowed. It was clearly an affront, a direct challenge to his natural order of things. He saw not a citizen asserting her rights, but a black woman who wasn't showing the proper deference. "Ma'am, are you refusing to comply with a lawful order from a peace officer?" The words were a classic trap, a trigger for a charge of resisting arrest, a charge that could justify anything that came next. "I'm clarifying my constitutional rights, as protected by the Fourth Amendment," Imani stated, her voice unwavering steel, sheathed in velvet. She would not be baited. She would not raise her voice. "I'm asking a simple question, which you are required to answer. What infraction did I commit?" He smirked then, a cruel, ugly twisting of his thin lips that showed a flash of yellowed teeth. It was the smirk of a man who held all the cards and was about to enjoy playing them. He finally glanced down at the registration in his hand, his eyes scanning the name and address. Then his gaze shot back to her face, a flicker of something dark and ugly, a grim sort of satisfaction, a perverse confirmation, passing through them. "We got a bolo out. Be on the lookout for a vehicle matching this description, driven by a black female, late 40s, early 50s, suspected of involvement in a violent felony. Now, for the last time, I am ordering you to step out of the car." He let his hand drop from his hip and rest, deliberately, on the worn black grip of his holstered Glock. The gesture was not a suggestion. It was a full-throated promise of violence. The humid air crackled, suddenly thick with a menace so profound it felt electric. The younger officer, Patterson, who had been a silent, tense statue, shifted his weight, his own hand now gripping his weapon, his knuckles glowing white in the flashing lights. This was no longer a traffic stop. It was a confrontation, a raw, naked assertion of power on a deserted stretch of road where their word was the only law, and the night would swallow any screams. Knowing that escalating the situation here, alone in the dark, miles from anywhere, was a losing proposition, a potential death sentence for some, Imani made the cold, calculated decision to survive. With a deep, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the frantic, panicked bird beating against the cage of her ribs, she pressed the button to unlock the doors. She placed her left hand on the handle, her right on the armrest, and pushed herself out into the blinding, disorienting glare. She held her hands slightly away from her body, open and visible, a universal gesture of surrender that tasted like ash and bile in her mouth. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest at the indignity. "All right, that's better," Caldwell grunted, his gaze sweeping over her tailored Armani suit and silk blouse with a mixture of obvious suspicion and sneering contempt. It was clear he saw her professional attire not as a sign of her standing in the community, but as a costume, a pretense he was about to rip away. "Turn around. Hands on the roof of the car. Now." The command was so egregious, so far beyond the pale of any legal justification, that for a moment, Imani's carefully constructed composure fractured. "Officer, you cannot be serious," she said, a hard, dangerous edge finally cracking the surface of her voice. The shock was beginning to curdle into a cold, focused rage that was a living thing inside her, awakening from a long slumber. "You have my identification. My name is Judge Imani Wallace. You can run my license plate. You can clearly see who I am." "I see a woman who matches the description of a killer," Caldwell shot back, his voice rising, his chest puffing out. He was enjoying this, savoring the power of it, the act of reducing her to nothing. He gestured with his chin to his partner. "Billy, cuff her." The world fractured. It slowed into a syrupy, surreal nightmare. The symphony of the crickets, the oppressive humidity, the flashing red and blue lights that pulsed like a malevolent heartbeat. It all faded into a roaring vortex in Imani's ears. The cold, sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting around her wrists was a sound she associated with the lowest moments in other people's lives. It was the sound that signaled the absolute loss of freedom, the final, brutal finality of the state's power. To feel the serrated steel bite into her own skin, to feel its cold, impersonal weight, was a profound, disorienting, soul-deep violation that reordered her entire universe. "My name is Imani Wallace," she said again, her voice dangerously quiet, each word a carefully polished stone of fury as Patterson roughly pushed her forward. Her cheek pressed against the cool, familiar metal of her own car, a car that had, moments before, been her sanctuary. "I am a circuit court judge for Hinds County. I am informing you right now. As an officer of the court, you are making a catastrophic, career-ending mistake." Caldwell let out a short, barking laugh devoid of any humor, a sound of pure, unadulterated derision. "A judge? That's a good one. A real good one. Billy, you hear that? We got ourselves a judge." He leaned in close, his foul, tobacco-laced breath hot against her ear, his voice a venomous, triumphant whisper. "You could be the queen of bloody England for all I care. Tonight, on this road, you're just another suspect in a felony stop, and we're going to find out what you're hiding. Search her." The search was a methodical, practiced degradation. Patterson's hands were rough, impersonal, yet every touch felt like a brand of humiliation, a deliberate stripping away of her identity, her station, her very selfhood. They went through her pockets, then unlocked her car with the keys they'd taken from the ignition. They tore into her briefcase, tossing her carefully organized case files, legal pads, and personal effects onto the dusty hood of the car like garbage. A small, silver-framed photo of her and her father. Taken on the triumphant day, she passed the bar, skittered across the hood, and fell to the gravel with a soft crunch. "What's all this legal crap?" Patterson asked, his voice laced with genuine confusion as he held up a file marked with the state seal of Mississippi. "I told you. I am a judge," Imani repeated, her voice tight with a fury she dared not unleash, knowing it would only be met with more violence, and worse, would give them the justification they craved. She was no longer just angry. A cold, crystalline clarity was forming in her mind, pushing through the rage and humiliation. She was documenting every violation, every word, every gesture, building a case in her head. "Looks to me like you're playing a lawyer," Caldwell sneered, picking up her wallet from the scattered contents of her purse. He rummaged through it until his thick fingers found her judicial ID. He stared at the photograph, at the official state seal, his smug, confident expression faltering for the first time. The blood began to drain from his florid face, leaving a pasty, mottled pallor. He glanced at her, cuffed and pressed against her car, then back at the ID, his mouth working silently as he read the title embossed in gold letters beneath her name. Circuit Court Judge, 7th Judicial District. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, broken only by the chirping of the crickets, who were indifferent witnesses to his entire world crumbling around him. The hunter had just realized he'd trapped a lion. "Billy," he said, his voice suddenly stripped of all its earlier bravado, now thin and reedy, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "Billy, get the sheriff on the radio." The holding cell at the Rankin County Sheriff's Department was a monument to human misery. It smelled of bleach, industrial disinfectant, stale sweat, and the lingering ghost of 1,000 desperate, unanswered prayers. The air was cold and dead. The single steel bench, bolted to the concrete floor, was as cold and unyielding as the law she had wielded just that afternoon. For 2 hours that felt like an eternity, Judge Imani Wallace did not sit in suspended disbelief. Disbelief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she sat in a state of cold, crystalline fury, a diamond-hard rage that was terrifying in its focus. She mentally drafted the lawsuit, her legal mind working with chilling precision. She identified and cataloged every violation: the unconstitutional stop under Wren versus United States, the lack of reasonable suspicion for the stop itself, the illegal command to exit the vehicle absent any threat, the unconstitutional search of her person and property, the wrongful arrest without probable cause, the excessive force of the handcuffing. She was no longer a victim. She was a jurist, a plaintiff, and a warrior preparing for battle. She could hear the frantic, hushed conversations from the corridor outside the cell's barred window. Voices rose and fell in panicked whispers, a symphony of bureaucratic terror. "Get the county attorney on the phone now." "Is it the Judge Wallace?" From Hines. "Christ almighty, when God's name did Caldwell do?" The ripples of their catastrophic mistake were spreading, and a storm of her making was gathering on the horizon, ready to unleash its biblical fury. Finally, the cell door clanged open with a sound of profound finality. It wasn't Caldwell or Patterson who stood there, but a pale, profusely sweating man in a sheriff's uniform, his jowls trembling like gelatin. His name tag read Miller. He held her blazer and briefcase in his hands, as if they were holy relics he was unworthy to touch, her scattered papers now neatly, almost reverently, res-tacked. "Judge Wallace, ma'am, there's been a terrible, terrible mistake," Sheriff Miller stammered, his apology a torrent of pathetic, self-serving excuses. "My deputies, they're new, ma'am. Inexperienced. The bolo, it was vague." "The bolo was for a woman named Sarah Johnson, Sheriff," Imani cut in, her voice as cold and sharp as chipped ice, cutting through his blathering like a surgeon's scalpel. "A black woman, in a dark-colored sedan." That was the entirety of her description. And that was enough for your inexperienced deputies to assault, illegally detain, and humiliate a sitting judge. Their inexperience is not an excuse, Sheriff. It's an indictment of your leadership and your department's culture. "I want my lawyer." and I want him now. The scandal detonated across the state like a dirty bomb. The dashcam footage, leaked to a Jackson news station by a disgruntled deputy who despised Caldwell, went viral within hours. It was a sickening masterclass in the casual, brutal abuse of power, made all the more potent by Imani's steely, unwavering composure in the face of it. Caldwell and Patterson were suspended, their careers vaporized in the white-hot crucible of public outrage. Sheriff Miller issued a series of increasingly desperate, groveling public apologies. But Imani Wallace was far beyond apologies. This was never just about her. Her humiliation, her fear, her rage, it was a reflection, a magnification of what happened every day to people who didn't have Judge in front of their name, who didn't have a monogram briefcase and an Armani suit, who didn't have the resources to fight back. Her ordeal was a symptom of a deep and insidious disease eating at the heart of the justice system. And as her initial, hot anger cooled, it hardened into a righteous, laser-focused fury. Her attention narrowed, with the intensity of a hawk spotting its prey, on the name that had been used as the flimsy pretext for her ordeal, Sarah Johnson. Who was this woman? And what was the real story behind the violent felony that had set these terrible events in motion? She took a leave of absence from the bench and placed a call. Within a day, she was sitting in her home office with Frank Donovan, a retired FBI agent whose soul seemed to be powered by stale coffee, unfiltered cigarettes, and a bottomless well of righteous indignation. He was a rumpled, weary bloodhound who lived for the hunt. "Find out everything, Frank," Imani instructed him, her voice low and resolute. "About Sarah Johnson, about the bolo, and about the man she supposedly murdered, Marcus Thorne." Frank's investigation began not on the street, but in the dusty, neglected basement records room of the local courthouse. He found a file on Marcus Thorne, a wealthy local construction magnate and celebrated philanthropist, that was thick with dismissed domestic disturbance calls. 6 calls in 2 years, all from the same address, all quietly resolved without charges. A pattern of smoke with no official fire. Frank's next stop was an emergency clinic on the poor side of town. He sat in a small, sterile interview room, his gentle, world-weary voice a stark contrast to his imposing frame, coaxing a story from a nervous night shift nurse. "I remember her," the nurse whispered, twisting a paperclip in her hands, looking over her shoulder as if ghosts might be listening. "Sarah Johnson. Came in about 6 months ago. Classic battered woman presentation. A fall down the stairs that somehow resulted in a broken rib and a black eye. She was terrified, but he was here. Thorne, right out there in the waiting room, charming everyone, buying sodas for the staff from the vending machine. He paid for her treatment in cash. A big wad of it. Told me to take extra good care of his clumsy girlfriend." The way he said it, it was a threat. The true bombshell landed on a Tuesday night. Frank called Imani, his voice tight with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. Raw shock. "Judge, you need to sit down for this. I got into Thorne's financials. The construction company. Most of it's legit, but some of it is a front. I found his real ledgers, hidden on a server behind layers of encryption. Judge, this isn't about domestic abuse or even murder. It's about something out of a horror movie." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "He wasn't just beating these women, Judge. He was trafficking them, but not for sex. The ledgers, their meticulously detailed records. Names, dates, physical stats, and prices. He was sourcing people from the absolute margins of society, runaways, addicts, the undocumented, and selling them. Not for labor, but for their constituent parts. He was supplying a black market for human organs. Marcus Thorne, the beloved philanthropist, was a monster of unimaginable evil. Meanwhile, in a different county jail, Sarah Johnson was living her own nightmare, one that had begun long before the steel bars clanged shut. Her world had been a cage of terror for years, and Marcus Thorne had been its smiling, handsome warden. A flashback, sharp and vivid as a shard of glass, tears through her consciousness. The suffocating control, the way he would isolate her from friends and family with poison-laced kindness. The public charm that could curdle into private, silent violence in the blink of an eye. She relived the night of his death, not as a murder, but as a desperate escape. Thorne, high on a cocktail of cocaine and rage, his face a mask of inhuman fury. He wasn't jealous. He was incandescent because he discovered she'd found his hidden office, the one with the locked file cabinets and the dedicated server. "You stupid bitch, do you know what you've done?" he had screamed, his voice a guttural roar as he ripped a thick leather belt from his pants. The chase through the palatial, sterile house, her desperate flight to the kitchen, the glint of the Wusthof knife block on the granite countertop, the single, desperate, upward thrust born of pure survival instinct. Her court-appointed lawyer, an overwhelmed public defender much like Keisha's, had told her to plead guilty to manslaughter. "It's your only shot, Sarah. A jury won't believe you against a man like Marcus Thorne." Then, one day he was gone. In his place was a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman from a top Jackson law firm, her suit as impeccably tailored as Imani's. "My name is Eleanor Vance," the woman said, her eyes kind but radiating a formidable intensity. "I'll be representing you from now on. An anonymous benefactor who believes in your innocence is funding your defense." For the first time in years, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to grow in the barren, scorched soil of Sarah's heart. The trial was a media circus. The district attorney, a close personal friend of Marcus Thorne's who had eulogized him at his lavish funeral, painted Sarah as a greedy, manipulative, gold-digging harlot who had killed her generous benefactor in a fit of pique. But Eleanor Vance, armed with Frank Donovan's meticulous research and fueled by Imani's silent, unyielding support from the front row of the gallery, systematically dismantled the pristine myth of Marcus Thorne. She put the terrified nurse on the stand. She presented the 6 dismissed police reports as a pattern of escalating violence and systemic failure. When Sarah herself testified, her voice, at first a trembling, barely audible whisper, grew in strength and clarity as she spoke her truth. "He told me I was worthless," she said, her eyes locked on the jury, no longer seeing them as accusers, but as people. "He said if I ever left, he would put me in the ground, and no one would even come looking. He said he owned me. That night, I decided I wanted to live more than I was afraid to die." The not guilty verdict was a tectonic shock in the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The DA stood, slack-jawed. Sarah collapsed into her chair, sobbing not in grief, but in overwhelming, cathartic release. And from the front row, Imani watched, her face a mask of judicial calm, her heart a symphony of roaring, triumphant vindication. The FBI raids the next morning were a coordinated blitzkrieg across 3 states. In a pristine suburban mansion, a prominent transplant surgeon was dragged from his bed in silk pajamas. In a downtown high-rise, a hospital administrator was handcuffed over his morning espresso. In a quiet, rural compound, agents uncovered the horrific truth of Thorne's operation. The headlines were seismic, shaking the state's medical and social elite to their foundations. Imani Wallace returned to the bench, her very presence now carrying a different kind of authority. She was no longer just an interpreter of the law. She was its guardian, its conscience, its living embodiment of the shield her father had spoken of. She looked at the faces of the accused who came before her differently now, always wondering about the story that wasn't in the file, the truth that lay buried beneath the sterile language of the indictment. Sarah, with a new name and a new life funded by substantial, anonymous trust, moved to a quiet city in another state. She used the money to open a shelter, a beautiful, secure house with a garden, a place she named the Keisha House, a sanctuary for women to escape the monsters who looked like men. Sometimes, late at night, when Imani took the long way home along the Natchez Trace, letting the symphony of the Mississippi dark wash over her, she would pass the small gravel shoulder where her world had been turned upside down. She would remember the blinding, strobing lights, the cold bite of the steel, the smug, ignorant faces of men who thought they held all the power. They had meant to humiliate her, to break her, to put her in what they believed was her place. But they had failed. They hadn't understood who they were dealing with. They had lit a match, intending a small, contained fire of intimidation on a lonely road. Instead, they had started a blaze, and Judge Imani Wallace had used its cleansing, righteous flames to burn their whole rotten world to the ground.